Karthik, before we go to the floor, just take one point each if you want to address.
Well, thank you so much for both those comments. A lot to think about, definitely. Kanti, thank you so much for all those views. I think before I think anyone goes to work on a specific case or an issue in Indian foreign policy, they go back to your work on schools of Indian thought and foreign policy, and sort of see where they can sort of place themselves, and I certainly did that before I embarked on my work, and it influenced sort of how to think about Indian foreign policy, at least in an ideational way. I think the point you raised about the futures is going to be the really important one going ahead, right? If you go by the arguments in the book and what I've mentioned, then what we can expect as India further embeds itself within the international economy and its interests further deepen across different issue areas, particularly those related to technology and the internet, there will be a clear demand to be not only be more open, but also be more liberal, and have a clear rule-shaping sort of tendency, without which then you have to play by the rules that others create in the end. So there's a clear, demand that will rise because India's economy is growing and its size in the international order will only get bigger. And that in itself, which is what the book argues, will shape a lot of domestic interests who will then influence the negotiators to behave a certain way abroad. So I think that's going to be clearly an important issue going ahead. And if I would probably argue a certain way, India is going to become more liberal, open, and embedded within various regimes that are emerging to negotiate a lot of these technology issues, especially, and you could see that going ahead. I don't think I really sort of intended to produce a rationalist account of India's multilateral behavior, but I think going through the sources, as you mentioned, in the archives, and tracking each set of negotiations and what the Indian officials said at each negotiations, and what happened before negotiations back home, you could connect both what was happening at the domestic level and international level, which to me essentially sort of led to my rationalist argument. And as much as I would have, as much as I was playing against or arguing against a terrain that was excessively culturalist in tenor or defensive in tenor, I think the sources and the empirical materials, drove me to the argument that, I eventually arrived at. And with Amitendu's comments, I agree with on the trade part. It's going to get, far more difficult, and there are a lot of parallel regimes and frameworks that are emerging to discuss emergent trade issues, especially related to e-commerce and data, and so on and so forth. And I think there will be enough capacity domestically to engage on these issues because of not only the demand that interest groups pose toward government, expecting them to not just be aware of what the domestic interests are and all these issues, especially data, AI, e-commerce, so on and so forth, but also develop provisions that in a way advance those interests. So the whole issue of capacity, and that's something I really wanted to get at through the book, is that India has always been understood to be, at least in terms of foreign policy, insufficient in terms of capacity, but no one really goes out and tries to explain what capacity is or what capacity means. And the standard that most people generally use is the number of MEA officers, which is about the same size as Singapore. But as I tracked these negotiations, and each set of negotiations, having a smaller delegation was actually far better than having a delegation with 30, 40 people, right? as long as the people leading that delegation were knowledgeable enough of the issue being negotiated and able to articulate your positions abroad, then that is far more effective than having 30, 40 voices in the room, which is what the Americans and the Europeans have in many ways. So having a small delegation is not necessarily it's not necessarily incapacity, but it could be a strength. And the second point I would definitely say is, even on the trade front, and you brought up RCEP and the other sort of issues that India has been negotiating quite recently, and the fact that trade has been moved largely from the multilateral ambit to other spaces. There are a lot of preferential trade agreements that have been emerging in the last 2-3 decades. There are other frameworks, multilateral frameworks, that consider certain parts of trade, especially those dealing with technology. And I think India can negotiate there, and has. And even at RCEP, there was, and over 7 years of negotiations, there were multiple rounds. And from what I could gather from the evidence out there, is that, on a number of different issues, especially related to services, the agreement would have hamstrung India's hand to regulate these issues domestically, especially related to the investor settlement dispute mechanism, or data, or some of the other, sort of non-goods issues that were being negotiated. And the fact that they withdrew from the agreement is not necessarily a reflection that India is in a way stepping back, or is not necessarily choosing to work with partners, especially in East and Southeast Asia, that are in the forefront of economic growth. But it's taking a step back and saying, let's just see how this fits into what our interests are, and if it's going to advance them, not just in the short and medium term, but long term. And I think that's a reflection of negotiating capacity and strategy. So again, not to belabor upon my point, but India does negotiate, and negotiates well, and has been for at least since the 1980s. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll open up the floor now for discussion. So please identify yourself and ask a short. Yeah.
I would like you to present you the 180 years of Toronto, as you have been in connection with the University of Toronto. I have been advisor of the University of Toronto, York University, builder of Seneca College, and Richmond University. I stayed in Canada for 32 years. Can I present you this one?
We'll take it later, sir. Thank you. Ambassador Pandit, we'll take it later. Thank you so much.
Let me congratulate Karthik for what is almost an impossible book to write, given all the vagaries of Indian politics. My first point would be, Singaporeans don't know how lucky they are that they don't have to negotiate in such a manner, because the government does all the thinking, the negotiators go there and do all the work. But Karthik's book, the essential point is, before that, let me say, I was honored to be involved in two of these agreements that you spoke about, the Climate Convention and the Uruguay Round. The Climate Convention, I was in the peripheral. I only went there to carry Tomiko's bag. After that, I left him and went and played golf, and I had a hole-in-one in Rio. That's my claim to fame. But in the Uruguay Round negotiations, I was right and center, because I was chairman of the Trade Negotiating Committee. Subsequently, was chairman of the WTO, which was responsible for putting all the negotiations in place. So I know how difficult it was because half the hair I lost was from that process. And I dealt with two of the most formidable Indian negotiators, Ambassador Zuchi first and Ambassador Narayan. Ambassador Zuchi was a very crafty, very skilled, excellent. Mr. Narayanan was a very nice chap, very nice chap. And we used to feel sorry for him because he had to negotiate with us and then he had to negotiate with his own government. And his own government, he had to go also negotiate with all the other parties involved. So it was almost an impossible task. So your book really brings out the intricacies of negotiations, at least in the trade field, as far as India is concerned on international agreements. There was also another element. There was a chap in Geneva called T.N. Raghavan. T.N. Raghavan was a member of the Third World Network, and he will put all the negative comments he could get to make sure that the process doesn't go forward. So the Indian ambassador had three groups to negotiate. It was almost an impossible task. And India also had the responsibility of taking the G77 and the less developing countries, less developed countries, also on board. So that's why the book shows the intricacy. But what is important is, and what I didn't realize, the amount of pressures coming from various sources to give in, not to give in, to give in, not to give in, and when to give in. That's the essential value of this book, which I've not come across anywhere else. Finally, let me say how the Uruguay round was concluded. It was not concluded by great minds agreeing. It was concluded by the trade minister of Malaysia, Rafida, one morning coming into the room and said, "No problem now, we can put new issues, we can just talk about new issues." That was good enough. We ran with that and concluded the Uruguay round. Thank you.
That is a substantive comment. You want to respond briefly?
No, that's knowledge for me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'll be brief. Now, this is a good book, I think. And India does negotiate. And following from what Ambassador Nachiappan is saying, it strikes my mind that India uses smart power, soft power, okay, and they have been pretty successful. The Indians are good negotiators. I am Adrian Villanova. I am involved in negotiations for a long time. And it's also cultural based. And I think if you could, your second edition of your book, maybe focus on the use of hard, soft power, clever power, smart power. That would be interesting, especially for many people, diplomats and even business people. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. At the back, somebody has a hand. Yeah, there. Yeah.
This is Diego from ISAS, Karthik's colleagues. I have two quick questions. The first one, is your case selection based on the dependent variable, basically? So you selected cases where India negotiated, and therefore you reach a conclusion that India actually negotiates. Had you chosen different cases, would you have reached different conclusions? And if this is the case, that India sometimes negotiates and sometimes not, is your point about institutional capacity, and in particular, the number of officers that India has. India is one of the smallest bureaucracies in the world in per capita terms, and this limits the number of people who can actually do all the groundwork that is necessary for that small number of people that reach the negotiating room to be prepared and to engage effectively in negotiations.
Thank you, Diego. So in my the case selection, the time period I was looking at, there were only about 8 to 9 cases that I could pick from that formed the universe of cases, that India negotiated rules within a certain time period. I was looking at multilateral agreements within international regimes, so that limited as well. So, and within the 8 or 7 or 8 cases that were on the list, I picked 4 that had enough variation within them to measure the efficacy of the framework that I was applying. So, and that's sort of the method I used, to sort of narrow down the universe of cases, and from the universe, the ones that I eventually picked. There were some considerations that were made, in terms of which of these agreements had a lot of resources online. So all the cases that I focus on in the book, had an extensive virtual archive where every round of every negotiation was posted. So I could go there and visit and track what every Indian delegation did, what the negotiators said, the documents that were issued. So that was also, part of the consideration. So I ensured that there was enough variation in between the cases. So there were some that India was really keen on agreeing to, and some that it rejected, and some that was in the middle, but it eventually acceded to, just to test and, sort of measure the efficacy of the framework that I applied. And the second question on institutional capacity, can you repeat that again? I kind of lost you halfway, when...
Being the fact, given the fact that India has a very small bureaucratic apparatus at home in per capita terms, this affects the kind of work that goes in preparation of negotiations. So Indian policymakers need to choose which issues to negotiate and which not, simply because they don't have the capacity to negotiate them all.
Right. So the one thing about multilateral issues, I don't know how it extends to, some of other sort of bilateral issues that Indian diplomats deal with. There was a clear inclination and desire to draw from the non-governmental sector and pull people in for short periods of time and place them at negotiations to negotiate on behalf of India. So there was a clear and openness to allow people who were more knowledgeable, who were experts on some of the issues that are covered in the book, to go and sit and negotiate these provisions. So one example was, the case on tobacco control. The lead negotiator for tobacco control was and is still a leading cardiologist in India. He is a part of a robust tobacco control movement and has been for the last 40 years. He has been part of that whole sort of movement to change India's tobacco laws, to make it more difficult for people to advertise, for firms to advertise tobacco products and consume them, especially in public places. So this was a man who was clearly, not just steeped in the tobacco control movement, but who was then brought in to negotiate these provisions on behalf of India on the FCTC. And it's no secret that some of India's stances and provisions during negotiations there were very progressive. It was because he was effectively leading the team with other officials from the health ministry and Indian diplomats on that front. So it was, again, it's not just what's within the state and within the Ministry of External Affairs and the other ministries, especially health for tobacco, but how much you can draw in from experts who have a lot of knowledge on some of the issues being negotiated.
Karthik, I think there's too much. The idea of state capacity had come up in different times. What about ideology? I think you could hire, say, good negotiators from, the expertise is not a problem. But a country that does not want to liberalize its economy would not be a great negotiator where the global framework is about getting everyone to liberalize their economies and opening their market access. Similarly, on the nuclear side, which was a country that believed, look, nuclear weapons were bad, was at the same time believed in disarmament, put itself in a situation where it won't do the tests in the CTBT negotiations. So it could say, look, I've done my tests, now I'm ready to negotiate. Or it would accept a framework that would limit its options fully. So therefore, the problem of ideology too, I think, is probably far more consequential in terms of how India defined its interests. I want all of you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could probably say that at any given time, there's kind of a prevailing ideology, and then within that, there's still space for domestic interest groups, different agencies within the state sector, and even individual leaders to, within the constraints that India faces. I mean, you can have an ideological position, but there's bearing down on you all the pressures of the international system. So one can imagine, to go back to the point that was made earlier, which is that the negotiators, in a way, are dealing with a prevailing international ideology, which is neoliberal internationalism, which is an international ideology in a sense. And then they're negotiating internally with all kinds of agencies and interest groups as well, some of whom bring ideology to the table, but some of whom bring very practical matters to the table as well. And then they're negotiating across institutional agencies, Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of this, Ministry of that, Ministry of the other. And yeah, so I think that ideology sets some limits, but I think that there's a constant record in India of having to, within that, produce some outcomes that are practical and sellable and implementable. And so, I mean, that's my broad thought. I mean, I think ideology does count for something, but the trick of the negotiator is within some broad kind of envelope of possibilities to do the best they can in these internal negotiations. The only other thing I was going to suggest was that on this issue of capacity, there's a literature in public policy on policy capacity, and it kind of speaks in a very structured way to what you were saying, which is that whatever the bureaucratic capacity may be, the numbers of officers and so on, capacity is a much larger issue of the ability to coordinate across many sectors and agencies, including private interests and groups, and including the media, academics, and a kind of public sector out there. So there India scores in a way much higher than one might think, just going by the size of the Ministry of External Affairs. And sometimes the ministry's smallness means, and the point that you made, that it's very efficient at being able to coordinate when it has to. I mean, in an emergency and when the rubber really hits the road, MEA seems to be able to pull together a lot of diverse interests.
Just to, I think I endorse this view by Professor Bajpai on the policy capacity. It's not a question of the number of bureaucrats that a country has, but it's more a question of having the right expertise at the right point in time. And this is where I'd like to emphasize on this point, that what happened at WTO and what was negotiated at WTO is actually 25 years ago. Today, a very different world has emerged on trade. And just to give a small example, India became a part of a parallel discussion under the WTO on the government procurement agreement right from the time that discussion was made parallel in 1998. But the public procurement bill was introduced in the Indian legislature in 2015. It shows the gap between what India had done in 1997 and the way the domestic regulatory agencies and actors became aligned to the reality. It took 20 years. And the problem within India is that unless the domestic political economy and the domestic changes take place, the capacity response remains submissive. So the capacity response comes internally. I mean, today there is a great deal of charge on building up commerce on e-commerce regulations, the capacity related to that. But India has been a part of the e-commerce regulations conversation at WTO from 1998. So one really doesn't understand why this gap has remained for such long.
You know, the issue with the ideas and ideology explanation when I was working on the thesis and then the book was, how do I rigorously, you know, sort of map a certain idea through these negotiations? And I always thought that the best way to do that was through the institutions. And you know, that in a way shows that how ideas come to life and how they influence not just, you know, the negotiators, the negotiating strategy, and then eventual outcomes. So I feel that there's a clear role for ideas, but it's nested within the institutional argument in the book, which gives ideas even more power than just sort of when people, you know, claim that ideas independently influenced certain outcomes or certain positions. What the book tries to do is show how certain ideas sort of map themselves through negotiators, through the institutional processes, and then eventually leading to a certain outcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question specifically about...
Identify.
My name is Aditya Singh. I'm a lawyer. I practice international law in Singapore. I have a question specifically about the negotiation of bilateral investment treaties and the way India has addressed those matters. Starting from the mid-90s, India signed tens of BITs, and everything was fine until a few years ago when India was sued by tens of foreign investors for hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars for certain policy changes in India. The most prominent ones obviously being Vodafone and the court decisions in India with respect to the sort of the 2G allocation spectrum scam. And suddenly you find now the government's position changing to, oops, we didn't know what we were getting into. This has taken a life of its own. And now 20 years later, a scramble to renegotiate 47 BITs in the last few years. So I guess my question goes back to something that's been discussed in the past. We understand the way in which India has been negotiating, but do you think that on technical matters, such as these BITs, there has been a tendency to negotiate without fully understanding the import of these technical agreements? And do you think there is a realization within the foreign policy establishment in India that, you know, this change of attitude or this dramatic change of attitude in such a short period of time can dent foreign investor confidence and the credibility at the international stage?
Look, I don't know enough about bilateral investment treaties. I think bilateral negotiations are a different kettle of fish than multilateral negotiations. Having more countries in the room, especially developing countries, really does change the context within which you negotiate and the way you negotiate. But that said, on the BIT side, I think all the negotiations in this book, even the ones that, you know, India acceded to, I think there's at least some of them you do it as a leap of faith. You don't really know, you know, what the implications are later on. Eventually, you know, when you do accede and sign and ratify, how you sort of, adhere to the provisions, and if you do adhere or not, that again is another issue, right? So what the book does is look at the process before negotiations and how and what happened during negotiations. And everything that happens generally after that is not, you know, within the control of what was being negotiated, right? Because of various other domestic and international and structural factors. But that's a great research idea, you know, for anybody looking to just measure the efficacy and the importance of what happens once you negotiate and ratify agreement and how you live up to them.
No, thank you for that question, but I think hopefully we'll need to take this conversation forward separately, because that's a subject in terms of, particularly in the bilateral commercial issues. I don't think much work has been done, but this is something certainly we would like you to be, engaged with us in developing a way in which we can talk about it with the large legal community and others that are present. Mustafa, you had a question.
Hello, hi. My name is Mustafa Izzuddin. I'm with Institute of South Asian Studies, a colleague of Karthik. I'd like to begin by congratulating you on your book on a topic that's very difficult, and as my ambassador Kesavapani has put it, impossible to write as well. But certainly it will spurn further research and provoke very important conversations going forward. I have two very brief questions. I think first, in the course of your research, which issue was the most difficult that India had to negotiate and negotiated successfully? And the second is, which issue that India put a lot of effort and resources into it but wasn't successful at the outcome? The second question is this, in a way building up to the earlier question on bilateral, multilateral. Maybe you did talk a little bit about that. Maybe go a little bit more as to what is some of the differences between the bilateral and multilateral side. Not necessarily commercial, but just a general framework for understanding how India negotiate. And perhaps in the context of how India has negotiated its bilateral relations with Canada to leverage on the time that you were there. Thank you.
The first question, I guess the answer to both your questions is the same, which is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It was the most difficult, for India to negotiate, at least at that time, because there was a lot of developments that were happening in the international system, which then influenced the negotiations and how major powers responded to those negotiations. So that treaty was intended to sort of ban nuclear tests, right? And India initially wanted to be part of that agreement, contrary to many views out there. I'd sort of love to hear what Raja and Kanti have to say about this as well. But as negotiations went on, they were more interested because it was one way to pin down the P5 powers and their ability to upgrade their nuclear arsenals. But over time, after the NPT was extended in 1995, and the P5 powers began to sort of change their attitudes within CTBT negotiations, once realizing that the nuclear arsenals would be, in safe hands because of the NPT, which would also allow them to do certain, underwater subterranean tests before they signed this agreement. So that, really changed the attitudes and minds of the MEA officials who were negotiating the CTBT at the beginning and during the middle when the NPT was extended, and later on in the end when they eventually rejected, because there was no way that India was willing to, accede to and ratify an agreement that did not change the existing nuclear order. And in terms of resources as well, I think there was a lot of effort that was put into those negotiations, not just in Geneva where the negotiations happened, but also within India. There was a lot of officials from various agencies, the Department of Atomic Energy, BARC, all these different agencies had different views on what India's position should be, and there were a lot of former diplomats, and there were other interest groups, especially the anti-nuclear groups that also had their own positions. So that chapter and that case really brings out a vibrant domestic debate, in terms of what happened, and so that in a way was the most difficult. On the bilateral, multilateral side, so what the differences are, was that the sort of nub of the question? Well, I think in the multilateral level, at least insofar as what I found from the book, I think there's more of an inclination to work with non-state actors as part of a formal delegation. And I don't think, that is as visible then or even now, when you're negotiating issues, on security issues or even with critical bilateral accounts, like China or Pakistan. There's not much of an effort to bring in outside expertise. I know that's changing slowly, but not enough. One can argue, and that really does change what and how India negotiates, right? Because these are people that, even though they're very well aware of what the national interests are, they're driven by their ability to and their understanding of the issue being negotiated, and what and how India should be placed in that context. So, which is why sometimes they generally tend to be more open, more progressive, and more open to also making concessions when, certain officials from the Ministry of External Affairs might not be. So I think multilateral negotiations are in a way far more open, more dynamic, and more accustomed to external shifts and changes than bilateral negotiations. That's my view. Thank you.
Is there any other questions? Otherwise, we will. Yeah. Sadesh Pandey, Deputy High Commissioner.
Not a question over here, just one or two comments. First of all, I'm really looking forward to read the book, and now sitting over here, I also becoming part of the subject of the discussion. That was something kind of gratifying. So I thought that from that angle, I will put one or two comments. First of all, there is a lot of discussion on a particular issue at multilateral negotiations and the domestic atmosphere over there, and whether there is any link and the stand taken at that time and ideology, political ideology. It's a very interesting subject, and it's really that everyone should read into, and I personally will be looking that aspect. Second thing, which was comparatively easier and which I'm going to speak about, is the issue of capacity, capability, and ideology, which was discussed at some length over here. And I'm so happy that the panelists themselves have answered it so well. And Karthik, in his statements, that India negotiates well. And also there are a lot of cross currents and a lot of different people who take part into the preparation for the negotiation. I just wanted to share one or two insiders' account on this point. When we get into any negotiation, I see there are a number of interministerial meetings and negotiations which is happening in India. When our negotiators come for negotiation, we meet them a day in advance at the evening or at ambassador's place. We see them carrying reams and sheaves of material with them. And half of that material is actually what the other ministries and other experts are saying. So when a negotiator sits on the table, there is always a lot of material for him to look into and refer to. Then we also see that the experts, good that you mentioned about tobacco negotiations. I have seen in India many ministries and at secretary level are handled by experts. And they are the ones who are giving guidance to various negotiations. Even in the subject that you have handled, if we see Shyam Saran's book on how India sees the world, or Shiv Shankar Venon's book on choices, in that also we find that the nuclear scientists and the experts, how they have come into negotiations, they have helped the diplomats, and the negotiations ultimately moved forward. Even here, sitting in Singapore for last 2 years, I have seen the RCP negotiations. One thing I like, that our team was small, but our team was always consistent. I see the same group of people coming over here and negotiating with the other side. So there is a consistency, and the same people for years and years looking into the matter, that ultimately helps India. I think our culture of having a cross discipline discussion helps in a long way to prepare India's position. And as far as issues are concerned, well, I am not sure whether we are looking into all issues. We really have to check that out. But whatever issues we find important, for example, Singapore is an Arctic Council. Even India is also an Arctic Council. Or outer space, we started negotiations on that since quite some time. So those issues which we consider are important for India's future, India has got involved into that since early stages, even though the expertise might not be developed at that particular stage. That's it.
Thank you. I think if there are no other comments, I think we will bring this to a close. But in the end, I thought I'd just offer three broad sets of remarks, I mean, not as a conclusion or as a summation. I think one of the challenges India, like most other countries, has faced, certainly in the post-91 period, is really the expansion of global capitalism and its demand to change the internal structures. That is, how you organize yourself is not sovereign entities, what you call the billiard balls negotiating with each other. The negotiation is about internal reorganization of other countries. That is, a capital, the global capital as it expands, it demands a certain set of changes how India organizes its economy, or Singapore organizes. Other Trump said Singapore is a currency manipulator, right? I mean, Singapore probably one of the closest countries to the US. So it is really how you internally organize yourself is contested by the dominant force in the international system. And the fact that everyone had to adopt to the same economic model meant, how do you relate to the new external pressures? And within that, the tussle then becomes between the irresistible force of globalization and the immovable force of domestic political economic organization. And it is that tussle that has played out. Those who've been smart enough to adapt to this quickly, smartly, have done better in international negotiation, and where the domestic resistance is too strong. For example, in India, to what is called the Dunkel draft, then the WTO, where there was a lack of consensus on how to reform, the problem became much harder, and much of the struggle for reformers, for the negotiators, has been that issue. This is fundamentally different from the kind of negotiations they had to do before as merely as state representatives. Second set of issues that have come is that even when negotiators have won space externally, the ability of the rest of the system to use that time and space to reform yourself. That is, if you don't internally change the way you do business, you're not going to be able to deal with the external demands. And I think that's been one of the biggest problems, the reluctance, the hesitant, the slow reform of India's internal structures becomes a problem in dealing with the outside world, how the outside world is organizing itself. For example, on the nuclear negotiations, it was more on the bilateral side. One of the central issues was about India needs to reorganize its Department of Atomic Energy, that will separate the civilian and the military. But for a military, for a defense, for the DAE that grew up controlling everything, it was a huge problem. They were not willing to see why they needed to do this just because Americans wanted it. While the logic of saying, look, regaining access to external supplies, that was good enough argument without giving up nuclear weapons if you can rejig your structure. But then that took a huge fight between MEA, which was calling for change, and the DAE, which was resisting change, and half the problem. And I think that's why in India took so many years to actually conclude a straightforward nuclear deal. So I think internal reform, I think the pace of internal reform is going to be a great determiner of how it's going to deal with the outside world. And that problem is not going away. And that's my last point, which is really, at a moment of structural change in the international system, I think India's problems are going to get even more demanding. For example, on the e-commerce, on the data rules. You see the daily spat between Indian Commerce Minister and the e-commerce companies. Now, if the nature of digitalization of the global economy is going to produce effects that demand a reorganization of, for example, it's not just Amazon that is saying, guys, open up, I want to have the freedom to sell, between anybody and anybody to the whole world. Jack Ma of Alibaba is saying the same thing. He wants to construct an Amazon-like platform that will let a craftsman in Moradabad to sell his goods to a consumer in Milwaukee. Now, that is the possibilities that the new platforms, the data management opens up. Now, to cope with this new change, you can resist it by saying, I won't change, or I will decide. Then I think you're setting yourself in a clash. The challenge for India is going to be how soon, if you have to have an assessment of where is the rest of the world going, particularly in a period of huge structural transformation driven by technological change, what is the best way of coping, and within which, what are the interests of Indian, and there, once we come to the interest, is it the interest of Ambani's, or is it the interest of the normal consumer? Is it the interest of the state that wants to control the activity? So those are the issues that become. So here I think that's why your book is the beginning, I think, of a journey that we need to be able to, I think, a larger number of people are going to be interested today in these issues. But I think we framed it, I think, too narrowly as a state versus state, or it is North versus the South. That's been the traditional framework in which we've looked at these negotiations. But today, I think, as India deals with this complex world, that we need to, as students of international politics, as students of policy, that I think we need to bring, for example, on the data-related issues, the private sector must play a role. It can't be just be determined by the Commerce Ministry, and where we've not really brought in the multiple players from the private sector, from the global players, and there I think the interplay of all these forces is going to shape India's negotiating challenges. And I think, I hope the work you've done will give us a foundation for ISAS to look at the new complexity and the new dynamism that we have to deal with. And there, for example, LKY School has its own Center for Globalisation, where Kanti is dealing with. We have the business school who deal with a lot of these issues, the law school, and the lawyers, of course, they make money out of this. So we hope Aditya Singh and others will join here. So I think we need to bring these communities together to see, look, what are the global changes? What are the problems for India, for most countries? And how do we relate these to what are the possible solutions? So I think that's where I hope that we can do more work together, our own colleagues at ISAS, with our colleagues, rest of the university, and in the city, so that ISAS, hopefully, we can take this kind of work forward. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and please join me in thanking our panel and congratulate Karthik for his excellent work.
Thank you, distinguished panelists, for such an interesting and engaging discussion on the publication. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we have come to the end of the ISAS book launch and panel discussion. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our future events. Please join us for a tea reception at the foyer. Have a good evening.